You were nothing but a charity case. An unwanted baby my mother took in out of guilt. Those words hit harder than watching my parents' caskets sink into the ground. My sister, Cassandra, waited until mourners were drifting back to their cars before she dismantled everything I thought I knew about myself. My name is Alana Whitehead. I'm 29 years old, and I live in the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut, where everyone knows everyone else, and secrets rarely stay buried longer than a cup of coffee at the local cafe. 3 days ago, my parents, Robert and Linda, were killed when a drunk driver ran a red light during a thunderstorm. They were on their way home from their 40th anniversary dinner, probably holding hands like they always did at stoplights. One moment they were alive. The next, they were gone. And now I was being told that maybe they'd never really been mine to lose. Before I go on, please take a moment to hit the like button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Thank you. The funeral reception was held in the church's community hall, the same place where I'd had my first communion, where my Girl Scout troop used to meet, where I'd always believed I belonged. I was standing by the coffee station, stirring sugar into that awful church coffee that somehow tastes like regret and furniture polish, when Cassandra approached with the focus of someone about to detonate something. She was 35, 6 years older than me, and she'd always used that gap like leverage. Today, she scanned the room, making sure Aunt Dorothy was distracted across the hall, then launched in. She said Mom and Dad had lied to me my entire life. That I wasn't their biological child. That I was the result of Mom's mistake before she'd even met Dad. According to Cassandra, they'd only kept me because the adoption agency had already placed me, and Mom had been too ashamed to admit she'd changed her mind. The room seemed to tilt. A few relatives stood close enough to hear, and I caught sight of Cousin Brooke already typing on her phone, probably lighting up the family group chat. Cassandra's face was unsettling. Her recent Botox treatment froze her expression as she delivered each detail, like a lawyer presenting evidence. She couldn't even summon real tears. Her forehead stayed locked in permanent surprise while my world collapsed. She told me it all made sense if I thought about it. She'd taken ballet lessons at the expensive studio downtown. I'd done gymnastics at the YMCA. She went to private school, I went public. She got a brand new car at 16. I got Dad's old Honda at 18. Only after he'd bought himself a new truck. She studied abroad in Paris. I spent my semester working at the hardware store to help pay for community college. The signs were always there, she said. You were just too clueless to notice. Aunt Dorothy started pushing through the crowd toward us, sensing something was wrong, but Cassandra wasn't finished. She pulled a folder from her designer purse, though I noticed the logo read Chanel, not Chanel, and waved it like a trophy. She announced, loud enough for the room to hear, that Mom and Dad's estate totaled $3.2 million between the house, Dad's hardware business, and their investments. Then she delivered what she clearly thought was the final blow. As their only biological child, she would inherit everything. I would get nothing. Not a cent. Because blood mattered, and I didn't have theirs. The hall erupted in whispers. Aunt Dorothy reached us and immediately began scolding Cassandra about timing and decency, while Cousin Brooke chimed in, saying everyone had always suspected I was different anyway. Different. Like I'd been an imposter exposed. Cassandra then informed me I had 30 days to vacate the family home, where I'd been living for the past 2 years while saving money and helping Mom with her arthritis and Dad with the business. She said she was being generous. Legally, she claimed, she could throw me out tomorrow. That night, I sat alone in what I'd always thought was my childhood bedroom, staring at photographs that suddenly felt staged. One from my 5th birthday caught my eye, Cassandra centered in her perfect pink dress, me off to the side with chocolate smeared on my face, wearing something obviously secondhand. Had they just been playing a role all those years? Were the birthday candles, the bedtime kisses, the proud smiles at my graduation just performances? My best friend Megan texted almost immediately, news travels fast in Millbrook. She told me to fight back, hire a lawyer, refuse to let Cassandra erase my life. My boyfriend Jake had a different take. He suggested maybe it was better to walk away, that fighting over money would turn me into someone just as bitter as Cassandra. I wanted to scream at him that this wasn't about money. It was about identity. About belonging. About realizing that maybe the family I thought I had was never truly mine at all. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Cassandra downstairs speaking with a locksmith about replacing the locks. She wanted expensive electronic ones, but she'd brought the wrong key, an old padlock key instead of the house key. The locksmith had to explain, 3 separate times, that you can't duplicate a front door key from something meant for a gym locker. It almost would have been funny if it hadn't been so heartless. Later that day, she had her husband, Derek, deliver a formal eviction notice. He stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the ground, muttering an apology before practically jogging back to his car. The days that followed blurred together, filled with humiliations and revelations. I started replaying every memory through this new filter, suddenly spotting things I'd been too trusting to question before. When Dad once said, "Family isn't about blood. It's about showing up," I thought he was just being reflective. Now it sounded like a confession. Mom's constant reminders that I was special, that I was chosen for something meaningful, felt less comforting and more like guilt in disguise. Even the way they sometimes looked at me, with a quiet tenderness tinged by sadness, made sense now. They hadn't been seeing their child. They'd been seeing someone else's. Cassandra wasted no time asserting control. She'd already gone to the bank, trying to access Mom and Dad's accounts, only to be turned away until proper paperwork could be verified. She contacted Dad's business manager at the hardware store, announcing that changes were coming. She even began telling people around town that I'd been disinherited because my parents had caught me stealing from them, a complete lie that spread through Millbrook like contamination. Mrs. Brennan, who'd been Mom's closest friend for 2 decades, crossed the street to avoid me at the grocery store. The pharmacist who'd known me since elementary school suddenly needed to check inventory whenever I walked in. At the coffee shop where I'd worked summers in high school, conversations died the moment I entered, replaced by forced smiles and averted eyes. Cassandra had been ruthless. She told anyone willing to listen that I had a drug problem, that I'd been stealing Mom's pain medication, that my parents had been planning an intervention before the accident. That lie hurt the most. Mom had suffered from severe arthritis for the last 5 years, and I'd been the one managing her prescriptions, tracking dosages, driving her to appointments when the pain made it impossible for her to drive. Cassandra twisted that care into suspicion. And in a small town, the most sensational story always wins. I found more proof of my supposed otherness in the attic. There was a box labeled Family Photos 1990 to 1994. Inside were pictures of Mom, Dad, and baby Cassandra. They looked whole. Complete. A perfect family of 3 that clearly hadn't been missing anything. Then there was a gap, nearly 2 years with no photos at all. And then suddenly, there I was. A toddler in mismatched clothes, clutching a teddy bear that looked older than I was. The care Mom had taken dressing Cassandra was gone. Megan came over that evening and found me sitting on the floor, surrounded by photo albums, crying over a picture from my first day of school. I stood slightly apart from the rest of the family, like someone had added me into the image after it was taken. She told me I was letting Cassandra poison my memories, that my parents had loved me regardless of biology. But then Megan noticed something strange. In Cassandra's baby pictures, Mom looked exhausted but joyful, like a typical new mother. In my earliest photos, though, even when she smiled, Mom looked sad. Almost like she was grieving. Jake was far less kind. He suggested this might explain why I'd always been so self-reliant, why I never asked for help even when I needed it. He said it like it was a flaw, like being adopted meant something in me was damaged. When I told him to leave, he admitted Cassandra had warned him I might become unstable once I learned the truth. They'd been discussing me behind my back, and he'd believed her. The full scope of Cassandra's lies became clearer when Derek called me one evening from his car, speaking in a hushed voice as if he were afraid she might overhear. He admitted she'd been planning this for months, ever since Mom and Dad updated their will 6 months earlier. She'd consulted a lawyer friend about inheritance laws, especially the difference between biological and adopted children. She'd been constructing a narrative where I was an intruder, someone who had taken what rightfully belonged to the real daughter. Then he told me something that made my blood go cold. Cassandra had been stealing from our parents for years. She'd siphoned money from their accounts, used their credit cards, sold some of Mom's jewelry and replaced it with fakes. Nearly $400,000 over 5 years, taken carefully, in small amounts that looked like ordinary expenses. Withdrawals that could have been explained away. Our parents had eventually noticed, Derek said. About a year before they died. But they never confronted her because Cassandra threatened to tell me about the adoption in the most vicious way imaginable if they did. The realization made me physically sick. They had endured theft, manipulation, and betrayal to protect me from exactly what was happening now. They'd chosen my emotional safety over their own financial security. And that, more than anything Cassandra had said, told me the truth about who my parents really were. And Cassandra had turned their love for me into a weapon against them. 3 days into the eviction notice, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. That call changed everything. The man introduced himself as Mr. Thornfield from Thornfield and Associates, my parents' attorney for more than 35 years. His voice was precise and deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned to speak carefully so nothing could be misunderstood. He told me that Cassandra had, in fact, shown him a will. But there were additional documents she didn't know existed, papers my parents had explicitly instructed him to keep confidential until after their deaths. He suggested we meet. Not at his office. Cassandra had been calling him hourly, issuing threats, and had even arranged for someone to watch his building. Instead, he proposed the coffee shop on Maple Street at 2 o'clock. Before that meeting, I remembered something Derek had mentioned about checking my mother's jewelry box. I found it tucked in her closet, the painted blue flowers faded from years of use. The bottom felt thicker than it should have. When I pressed along the edges, a hidden compartment slid open. Inside was a safe deposit box key and a note in my mother's handwriting. It read simply, "For Alana. The truth matters." There was also an old padlock key, nearly identical to the one Cassandra had mistaken for a house key at the locksmith. I realized she must have found a similar key somewhere and assumed it meant something important. Meanwhile, Cassandra's campaign against me escalated. She persuaded Cousin Brooke and 2 others to sign statements claiming they'd seen me repeatedly asking my parents for money and pressuring them to change their will. Brooke owed Cassandra $5,000 from a failed business venture, so her loyalty had clearly been bought. The other cousins had their own incentives, promises Cassandra had made about future payouts from the estate. The worst moment came when Cassandra accidentally sent a text meant for Brooke to the entire family WhatsApp group. It read, "Remember, if anyone asks, Alana has been unstable for years. I've already told the lawyers she's been stealing. Once the house sells, you'll get your money plus extra for helping. Mom always said Alana was a mistake we had to live with. Now we can finally fix that mistake." The fallout was immediate. Aunt Dorothy posted screenshots to Facebook with a blistering commentary about greed and disgrace. Uncle Pete called Cassandra directly and told her she was no longer welcome at family gatherings. Several cousins left the group chat in protest. Cassandra tried to claim her phone had been hacked. No one believed her. Her own ambition had exposed her. At the coffee shop, Mr. Thornfield waited in a corner booth with a thick folder resting beside him. He looked exactly like the lawyers from old movies, wire-rimmed glasses, a suit that probably hadn't been fashionable since the mid-90s. But his eyes were sharp. And when he began speaking, I understood why my parents had trusted him. He started with a story from 35 years earlier. My father's younger sister, Rebecca, had been 17 and pregnant. The baby's father disappeared the moment she told him. Rebecca also suffered from a serious heart condition that made the pregnancy dangerous. My parents, newly married and trying to start a family of their own, took her in. She lived with them throughout the pregnancy. They promised to raise her child as their own if anything happened to her. Rebecca died just hours after giving birth to me. She lived long enough to name me Alana, after our grandmother, and to make my parents promise I would always know I was loved. The adoption was legal and formal. I was their daughter in every way that mattered. Then came the truth that shifted everything. Cassandra wasn't their biological child either. She had been adopted at the age of 2 from my father's cousin, who couldn't care for her. Cassandra had known this since she turned 18, and she'd been using that knowledge as leverage against my parents ever since. Mr. Thornfield pulled out another document. My hand started to shake. 20 years earlier. When I was 9 and Cassandra's blackmail had begun, my parents created a trust. They placed nearly everything into it: the house, the hardware business, the investments. Everything except roughly $50,000 kept in checking accounts. The will Cassandra had been flaunting only covered what wasn't included in the trust. And the trust had a single beneficiary. Me. If you're still listening, thank you for staying with me through this story. Please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It truly helps more than you know, and your support during this difficult chapter means everything. Mr. Thornfield explained that my parents had meticulously documented everything over the years. Every forged check Cassandra had written. Every credit card she'd opened in their names. Every piece of my mother's jewelry she'd stolen and replaced with counterfeits. They kept receipts. Bank statements. Photographs of the fake jewelry alongside appraisals of the real pieces. They had built an airtight case. But they never used it. Because they still loved Cassandra. Still hoped she might change. The $400,000 she stole came in stages. At first, it was small amounts, hundreds here and there that they blamed on their own forgetfulness. Over time, it escalated to thousands at once, always accompanied by an excuse when questioned. Cassandra claimed she'd paid for repairs that never happened. Medical bills that didn't exist. Expenses they'd supposedly asked her to handle. And my parents, trying to keep the family together, let it continue. By the time my parents fully understood how far it had gone, Cassandra was taking tens of thousands at a time. And when they finally tried to confront her, she threatened to ruin me by revealing the truth about my adoption. Derek had seen parts of this documentation 2 weeks earlier, when Cassandra dragged him to Thornfield's office, trying to bully the lawyer into handing everything over immediately. While Cassandra ranted about her rights, Derek noticed papers on Thornfield's desk referencing a trust. When she wasn't looking, he snapped a photo. That was why he'd tried to warn me later, though he'd been too afraid of his wife to say more. Thornfield scheduled a formal reading at the courthouse for the following week. He cautioned me that Cassandra would likely escalate once she learned about the trust. But my parents had been very clear in their instructions. They wanted everything revealed publicly, in front of witnesses, so there would be no doubt about their intentions, or about their love for me. The safe deposit box I opened that afternoon held everything Thornfield had described, and more. Letters from Rebecca, including one written to her unborn child, to me, apologizing that she couldn't stay, but saying she was leaving me with the best parents in the world. Photographs of Rebecca that showed we shared the same eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same unruly hair that never quite cooperated. There was even a DNA test my parents had done when I was 5, confirming I was Robert's biological niece. But the most painful discovery was my mother's journal. Page after page documented Cassandra's escalating behavior, the heartbreak of being stolen from by one daughter while trying desperately to protect another. The impossible position Cassandra had forced them into. One entry from the previous year stood out. We failed Cassandra by giving her things instead of boundaries. But we will not fail Alana by allowing Cassandra to destroy her sense of self. The trust will protect her when we are gone. Meanwhile, Cassandra was already spending money she didn't have. Derek called to warn me she'd bought a Range Rover on credit, joined the most expensive country club in the area, and hired contractors for a $200,000 renovation of my parents' house. She was so confident in her inheritance that she'd been telling everyone she expected more than $3 million within the month. The town was starting to turn on her. Her behavior at the funeral, where she wore what looked like a rejected reality TV outfit, all leather and lace, to our parents' memorial, had already raised eyebrows. The locksmith had been telling people about her confusion with the keys. The bank manager shared how she'd screamed about discrimination when they refused to give her instant access to the accounts. Even her fake designer bags became a joke, especially after the handle of her Gucci purse snapped during the reception, spilling its contents across the church floor. 3 days before the will reading, Cassandra hosted what she called a memorial gathering at our parents' house. She sent out formal invitations printed on expensive cardstock. But her real motive was obvious: she wanted to make a public show of ownership, to prove she was in charge. I wasn't invited. Aunt Dorothy insisted on bringing me anyway. When we arrived, Cassandra had already removed Mom's beloved garden decorations and replaced the handmade welcome mat with a generic store-bought one. Inside, she had arranged Mom's belongings like a garage sale, each item tagged with the name of who would receive it. Everyone was getting something, except me. She stood at the head of the dining room table, dressed in white at our parents' memorial, handing out possessions like cards in a casino. When she slipped Mom's wedding ring onto her own finger, I couldn't stay quiet. I reminded her that Mom had promised that ring to me, that she'd told me, on her last birthday, that it would be mine someday. The room fell silent. Cassandra laughed and said the gathering was for family only. Real family. That's when Aunt Dorothy stood up and said, "I've been more family than Cassandra is acting like right now." Several relatives murmured their agreement, and the polished act Cassandra had been maintaining began to fracture. That was the moment Mr. Thornfield entered the memorial gathering, briefcase in hand, dressed in a sharp suit that made it clear he hadn't come by accident. He looked purposeful, focused, and his timing was impeccable. Every member of the family was present to witness what followed. Addressing Cassandra formally by her married name, he announced that the official reading of our parents' entire estate would take place in 3 days at the county courthouse. He lingered on the word entire, and Cassandra's face visibly drained of color beneath her heavy spray tan. She snapped back that she already had the will and didn't need some theatrical court reading. Thornfield responded with a calm smile, the kind a chess player wears right before delivering checkmate. Yes, he explained, she did possess a will, but it was only one piece of the legal record. Our parents had explicitly instructed him to present all estate documents publicly, in open court, with witnesses present. Until then, any attempt to sell, distribute, or claim estate property would legally qualify as theft. His gaze drifted to Mom's wedding ring, still wrapped around Cassandra's finger. She immediately tried to remove it, but stress, alcohol, and swelling had worked against her. The room watched in silence as she tugged and twisted, growing more frantic by the second, before finally storming off to the kitchen in search of soap. We could hear the faucet running and her muttered curses echoing through the house. Uncle Pete quietly remarked that trash always has a way of revealing itself sooner or later. When Cassandra returned, her finger was red and irritated, but the ring was finally gone. Unbeknownst to her, Aunt Dorothy had been recording the entire event on her phone, pretending to photograph Mom's china collection. She captured Cassandra's rant about real family, her fixation on bloodlines, her claim that I'd never been wanted, and her attempt to distribute heirlooms before the estate had even been settled. By the time Cassandra noticed the mood shifting, the video was already circulating in the family group chat, the same one she'd been removed from after accidentally exposing herself weeks earlier. Then came the moment no one could have staged better. Cassandra's latest knockoff designer bag, an embarrassingly bad Gucci imitation with the logo spelled wrong, finally gave out. The bottom seam split open, dumping its contents across Mom's dining room floor. Out spilled 3 of Mom's stolen credit cards, overdue notices totaling thousands of dollars, printed emails showing Cassandra trying to sell Dad's classic car before probate, and worst of all, a handwritten list labeled after inheritance. On it were plans to pay off $60,000 in credit card debt and purchase a vacation home in Florida. Derek picked up one of the statements, his face turning ghostly as he read. He asked how they could possibly owe $40,000 to luxury retailers when he thought they were saving for a house. Cassandra hissed that it didn't matter, that everything would be paid off once her inheritance came through. She told him to think bigger, to understand they were about to be millionaires. But something in Derek finally snapped. In front of everyone, he admitted he'd seen the trust paperwork 2 weeks earlier, when Cassandra had dragged him along to intimidate Mr. Thornfield. He knew she wasn't inheriting $3 million. He knew about the money she'd been taking from our parents. And he was done pretending this behavior was normal, or acceptable. The man who'd spent 12 years too afraid to challenge her finally found his backbone. And he did it in front of 40 witnesses. Cassandra tried to regain control by accusing everyone of conspiring against her, claiming I'd poisoned the family against their real daughter. But then cousin Tyler, one of the people she'd bribed, spoke up. He admitted she'd promised him Dad's car if he lied about me borrowing money and never repaying it. Brooke, who still owed Cassandra $5,000, said nothing, but her discomfort was impossible to miss. As people began putting on their coats and preparing to leave, Cassandra made one final, desperate attempt at dominance. She declared that anyone who supported me would be cut off from the inheritance, that she had the power to destroy anyone who crossed her. That was when Uncle Pete, usually silent at family gatherings, stood up. He told her she was exactly the kind of person our parents had tried to shield me from. He said they would be ashamed of the person she'd become, and that no amount of money could ever fix that. 3 days later, the courthouse was packed well beyond capacity for the will reading. Nearly half of Millbrook showed up, drawn by the tension and spectacle that had been building for weeks. The courthouse was so overcrowded that court security had to turn people away. Someone had even set up a coffee cart outside, as if the whole thing were a public event instead of a legal proceeding. Cassandra arrived flanked by 3 attorneys she clearly couldn't afford. Men in tailored suits who grew more uneasy by the minute as it became obvious their client had misrepresented the most basic facts of the case. She wore head-to-toe black, clearly aiming for solemn and grieving, but the excessive self-tanner from the night before left her looking more orange than mournful. I sat in the front row, with Mr. Thornfield to my left and Aunt Dorothy to my right. A few rows behind us, Derek sat alone, having arrived separately from his wife. The rest of the family filled the benches, along with several of Mom's church friends, people who likely felt regret for how easily they'd accepted Cassandra's stories about me. Judge Patricia Hoffman presided over the hearing. She had known my parents for decades and had bought her first home with Dad's help from the hardware store. She had no tolerance for theatrics, especially in her courtroom. When one of Cassandra's attorneys tried to object before Thornfield even began, the judge silenced him with a single look that could have stopped a storm. Thornfield opened by reading the will Cassandra had been brandishing for the past 2 weeks. It was legitimate, properly signed 5 years earlier, and it did leave Cassandra $50,000, along with a handful of modest charitable donations. Cassandra smirked, convinced this proved she'd been right all along. But Thornfield wasn't finished. He produced a thick stack of documents and explained that 20 years earlier, our parents had created a family trust. That trust included the family home, the hardware business, all investment accounts, and assets totaling approximately $3.1 million. The will, he clarified, applied only to property not already placed in the trust, which amounted to the $50,000 and a few personal items. Cassandra's lawyers immediately objected, claiming they'd never been informed of any trust. Thornfield calmly replied that the trust had been filed with the court 2 decades earlier and was a matter of public record. Any competent attorney, he noted, would have uncovered it through even the most basic research. The attorneys turned toward Cassandra, their expressions a mix of anger and humiliation. When Thornfield announced that I was the sole beneficiary of the trust, Cassandra leapt to her feet, screaming that it was impossible. She shouted that I wasn't their real daughter, that I was adopted, that I had no right to anything. Her voice shook with fury, spit flying as she ranted about bloodlines and biological entitlement. That was when Thornfield delivered the final blow. Yes, he confirmed, I had been legally adopted after my biological mother, Rebecca Whitehead, died giving birth to me. Rebecca was Robert's younger sister, which made me his biological niece, a blood relative. Then he turned to Cassandra. She, too, had been adopted. She'd been taken in at the age of 2 when her biological mother, Robert's cousin, was unable to care for her. The difference was that Cassandra had known the truth for 17 years. Our parents had told her when she turned 18. The courtroom erupted. Cassandra stood frozen, her mouth open, unable to speak. Her entire identity, her claims of superiority, her insistence on being the real daughter, collapsed in an instant. She had tormented me with the truth of my adoption while hiding her own. Then Thornfield played the video our parents had recorded. Mom appeared on the screen, looking directly into the camera. Even though I'd already seen the recording in the safety deposit box, seeing her again broke me. I cried openly as she spoke about loving both of us, about giving Cassandra everything she demanded in the hope it would fill whatever emptiness she carried. She explained how the thefts began 5 years earlier and escalated beyond anything they could excuse or forgive. Dad's portion was harder to endure. He described discovering forged checks, finding credit cards opened in his name without his knowledge, realizing Cassandra had sold Mom's inherited jewelry and replaced it with counterfeits. He showed receipts, bank records, photographs comparing the real pieces to the fakes, $400,000 stolen over 5 years by the daughter they raised, while they worked desperately to shield the daughter they chose from having the truth used as a weapon. Mom then spoke about the most painful revelation of all. Cassandra had discovered the truth about my adoption when I was 9, after searching through their paperwork. She immediately turned it into blackmail, threatening to tell me in the cruelest way possible unless they paid for her private college, bought her cars, and funded her lifestyle. Every imbalance in our childhood that I'd quietly wondered about had been the result of extortion. That was the year they created the trust, when I was 9 and Cassandra was 15, specifically to protect my future from her greed. Even then, they knew she would take everything if given the opportunity. Their attorney had advised them to tell me the truth, but they'd chosen instead to protect my innocence. They wanted me to have a childhood untouched by the knowledge that my sister saw me as something to erase. But the most startling truth revealed in the video concerned the theft. Dad explained that they had noticed money going missing far earlier than they'd ever admitted, nearly 10 years before. At first, it was small amounts. A few hundred here, a little there. They told themselves it was simple forgetfulness, mistakes of aging, misplaced receipts. It was only when Cassandra's withdrawals grew bolder, jumping into the thousands, that they could no longer deny what was happening. They recorded everything. Every discrepancy, every unexplained charge. Yet they never contacted the police. They still loved her. Still believed she might change. The video showed Mom lifting a carefully organized box toward the camera. Inside was every piece of evidence they'd collected over the years, forged checks, fraudulent credit card statements, counterfeit jewelry, and receipts for luxury items bought with stolen funds. They hadn't saved it out of spite or revenge. They kept it as protection. They knew the truth would eventually surface, and when it did, they wanted me shielded from the fallout. The final portion of the recording was addressed directly to me. Dad told me I had never been a mistake. Never unwanted, never less than. Rebecca hadn't just been Mom's sister-in-law, she'd been her closest friend long before that. They had loved me even before I was born. When Rebecca died, they didn't see themselves as taking on a burden. They saw it as receiving a gift, the child they'd been hoping and praying for. Mom's closing words shattered what was left of my composure. She looked straight into the camera and said that blood might create a connection, but choice creates a family. She said they had chosen me every single day for 29 years and would continue choosing me in whatever came next. The trust, she explained, wasn't about money. It was about protection, about ensuring their chosen daughter would always be safe from the one who had chosen greed over gratitude. When the video ended, the courtroom was completely silent except for quiet sobbing. Even Judge Hoffman dabbed at her eyes. The only person not crying was Cassandra, though not for lack of effort. Her face, immobilized by years of cosmetic treatments, couldn't even properly form tears, leaving her looking eerily detached in that moment of complete exposure. Cassandra's attorneys were already closing their briefcases. One leaned toward another and whispered that she'd described me as a drug addict who had manipulated my parents into changing their will. Whatever loyalty they'd felt was gone. They wanted out. And were likely already figuring out how to withdraw without being pulled into the mess themselves. Cassandra, however, refused to stop. She screamed that the video was fake. That I had coerced our parents. That Thornfield was part of a conspiracy. She insisted the trust documents were forged, the adoption records fabricated, that everyone in the room was lying except her. Her voice rose higher with every accusation until she was no longer making sense, just shrieking rage into the air. That was when Derek stood. In front of the entire courtroom, he announced that he had filed for divorce that very morning. He said he had watched her steal from her parents, lie about her sister, and tear her family apart for money. He admitted he'd been weak and complicit for years, but he was finished. Then he turned to me and apologized publicly, saying he should have spoken up long ago and hadn't had the courage. Judge Hoffman had heard enough. She struck her gavel and ruled that the trust was valid and would be executed exactly as written. I would inherit everything contained within it. Cassandra would receive only the $50,000 outlined in the will, pending further legal action. The judge noted that the evidence presented could lead to criminal charges, which might jeopardize even that amount. Right on cue, Officer Mitchell from the Sheriff's Department entered the courtroom. He announced that, based on the documentation and testimony, an investigation into fraud, elder abuse, and theft had been formally opened. Cassandra was being charged. While she wasn't being taken into custody that day, she was required to surrender her passport and would be arraigned the following week. Her final humiliation came moments later. As she attempted to storm out, she tripped over her own fake designer bag, the strap wrapping around her heel. She hit the floor hard, and the self-tanner she'd layered on so heavily left a bright orange smear across the courthouse's white tile. Someone snapped a photo. It circulated around Millbrook for months afterward, captioned with jokes about karma and fallen queens. 6 months have passed since that day, and life in Millbrook has settled into a new rhythm. I'm living in my parents' house, our house now, though it still feels strange to think of it as mine alone. The garden is flourishing with the tomatoes Mom would have planted herself. Dad's workshop remains untouched, right down to the half-finished birdhouse resting on his workbench. Cassandra was convicted of fraud and elder abuse. The judge suspended her sentence on the condition that she complete 500 hours of community service and repay every dollar she stole. The $50,000 from the will vanished into legal fees, leaving her with nothing. The Range Rover was repossessed within a week. The country club membership was cancelled. The credit cards she'd maxed out while expecting millions became her burden alone. Megan saw her recently, working at a mall kiosk selling phone cases, insisting that rhinestone-covered plastic was worth $80. The designer clothes and luxury makeup were gone, replaced by a uniform and visible exhaustion. When our eyes met across the food court, she was the one who looked away. There was no remorse on her face, only the hollow acceptance of someone who had finally run out of moves. Derek sent me a letter last month. A real one this time. In it, he admitted he'd known about the thefts almost from the beginning but had stayed silent out of fear of being alone, fear of starting over. He said he was in therapy now, living with his brother, trying to understand how he'd become someone who could watch his wife tear her own family apart and say nothing. I wrote back and told him that forgiveness isn't instant. It's a process. But I'm trying. The cousins who had lied for Cassandra came clean after the video was played in court. Brooke sobbed as she admitted Cassandra had threatened to call in her debt unless she backed the story. Tyler confessed that the promise of Dad's car had made the lie feel small at the time. Their family, and families forgive, but trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. With part of my inheritance, I created the Robert and Linda Whitehead Memorial Scholarship at the community college. It's reserved for adopted students and those aging out of foster care, because family shouldn't be defined by bloodlines or paperwork, it should be defined by choice and commitment. The first student selected was a girl named Rebecca, which felt like more than coincidence. The hardware store is doing well under Uncle Pete's leadership. He's brought his son James into the business, keeping it in the family the way Dad would have wanted. I stop by occasionally, and the scent of sawdust and metal still brings me back to Saturday mornings when Dad let me help organize screws and bolts, never once mentioning that I was probably slowing him down. Mr. Thornfield and I meet for lunch once a month. He tells me stories about my parents when they were young, how excited they were when Rebecca came to stay with them, how they prepared for my arrival as carefully as if Mom herself had been pregnant. Recently, he told me the teddy bear in those early photos, the one I always thought looked worn, had belonged to Rebecca. She'd insisted I have it. Her final gift to the daughter she wouldn't live to raise. The mystery of why Cassandra always seemed to receive more growing up finally made sense when Thornfield showed me the complete financial records. Every expensive privilege she'd had, private school, cars, travel, had been paid for with money sent by her biological grandparents. Maria's parents, burdened by guilt, had supported Cassandra financially for years. My parents never touched that money for themselves. They used it exclusively for her. They'd been meticulously fair, even when it looked like favoritism. Aunt Dorothy has become my closest confidant. She told me she was there the night I was born, during a snowstorm so severe the roads were impassable. Dad helped deliver me himself. Dorothy held Rebecca's hand while Rebecca held me once. Just long enough to whisper my name and make everyone promise I'd always know I was loved. Dorothy carried that promise in her heart for 29 years. Last week, while planting bulbs for spring, I found myself talking to my parents. I told them about the scholarship recipients, about the store, about how their tomato plants won first place at the county fair. I told them I'd seen Cassandra at the mall and felt something unexpected, not anger, but pity. She'd had everything. Loving parents, a sister who admired her, a husband who stood by her. And she'd traded it all for money that was never truly hers. I saw her again yesterday at the grocery store. She was buying store-brand items, counting change carefully. The same woman who once racked up $40,000 in credit card debt without blinking. Our eyes met briefly over the produce. For a moment, I thought I saw regret. But then she turned away. Some people never learn that wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by who stands beside you when it matters. Standing in Mom's garden now, watching the sun sink behind the Connecticut hills, I think about what family really is. It isn't DNA tests or legal documents. It's Dad teaching me how to use a level when I was too young to be useful. It's Mom saving for months so I could have the prom dress I loved, even when money was tight because of Cassandra's demands. It's Aunt Dorothy protecting a secret for decades. It's Mr. Thornfield delaying retirement because he'd promised my parents he'd see their wishes honored. Cassandra was right about one thing, I was adopted. But she was wrong about everything else. I wasn't a mistake. I wasn't charity. I wasn't an outsider. I was chosen, deliberately, fiercely, and with love. My parents saw what was coming and built walls of protection, legal documents, trusts, safeguards, to keep me safe even after they were gone. They chose love over greed. Loyalty over blood. Blood may make you related. But loyalty makes you family. And love makes you chosen. And in the end, being chosen is everything.